Okay, hello Zach, Katie, Tobias, Camilo, you're back. Thank you from Houston. Can you guys hear me okay? I just want to do a sound check. Isamar, let me know if you guys can hear me okay. I'll get to video in just a sec. But if you can give me a yes, you're coming in loud and clear in the comments, I would appreciate that, just to make sure you guys can hear me. Southern Alberta, Jason, welcome. Lincoln, USA. Yes, Tobias, thank you. Loud and clear. Thanks, Katie. Appreciate that. Katie gives a shout out to Hi Donna. Okay, we'll get them on pretty soon here. That's awesome. So welcome everybody that is on so far. Stephen, hello, Kenya. That is fantastic. And we've got some generic LinkedIn users. Fantastic. So thanks for joining us this afternoon. We are going to be talking about a very, very cool subject, at least in my perspective. I love this stuff. I'm a big ambassador of systems design, systems thinking, participatory futures, immersion, creativity, all that good stuff in designing. Okay, you got your sound. Good, thanks, Tobias. In designing, using participatory futures and like methods and processes for emergency management, program design, legislation design, services, strategy, planning, all of that. And before we get really started, I just want to make sure that let you guys know next week we'll be talking to Chief Technology Officer Jacob Westphal from PEASI about public alerting, where I'm going to ask some questions about, you know, in hindsight, should public alerting have been used for COVID-19 or for pandemics? And a really controversial question that I want to ask people about is, should the public have access to public alerting? So stay tuned for that. And then at the end of the month, we've got Brandy Hunter from the Aspiring Emergency Managers Online group. She'll be on to promote that group and how you can be involved and contribute. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Donna Dupont. She is the founder and chief strategist in Foresight and Design for Purple Compass. You can find her at purplecompass.com. Donna brings skills and insights developed over 20 years working with leaders in emergency management, government public policy, strategic planning, and program design. Purple Compass is a strategic planning company focused on strategic foresight and human-centered design to support disaster risk management and sustainability. Purple Compass also hosts the Emergency Management Futures Lab, a lab designed to support anticipatory and adaptive leadership capabilities for resilience. And she has facilitated a range of foresight and design activities for clients in healthcare, emergency management, and right now, in fact, the Canadian military. Dr. John A. Sweeney is an award-winning futurist, designer, and author. He's worked in over 40 countries on 5 continents before COVID-19, I'm sure, because flying is trouble now, with extensive experience in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the MENA region. At present, he is an associate professor of futures at Foresight at Narhoz University in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and is also the Foresight advisor for Interpol. And he completed his PhD at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, focused on futures. So welcome to the show, Donna and John.
Thank you.
How are you today? How are you doing? Good? You're coming in good.
Doing really well. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Awesome. And so where I wanted to get started was, John, can you just give us a quick, brief breakdown of what participatory futures is, and maybe a little bit of an intro on the report that you co-authored with, I think Donna was involved, and others?
Yes, I'll happily start off and dive in, and then I would love to get Donna to add as well. So participatory futures really refers to the intersection of public engagement and future studies. And essentially, it's about a range of different approaches for engaging different communities, citizens. If you're an organization, you involve different stakeholders in thinking about the future. Now, of course, the truth is we think about the future all the time, but we often don't pay attention to the implicit biases, the structural assumptions that we might have. And so it's really about, can we actually find better, more critical, more creative ways to design processes that are more imaginative, more inclusive, and really more impactful? And so throughout the report and the process of doing that research, what we found is we're really going through right now a renaissance of participatory futures. Of course, there's a long history of foresight and using very engaging methods and dynamic means to help people think about the future. But we found over 300 case studies from all over the world of different organizations, governments, on a range of topics and issues to try to involve people in having more foresight, in being more anticipatory. And of course, the most important thing to notice is there's an S on futures. So at the heart of that is we're exploring multiple possibilities. And we do that precisely to try to shape the future. So we're not trying to predict, we're really trying to create better decision-making today and really try to feed collective action. And that, of course, is an asset for a range of different organizations. Donna, you want to jump in?
Sure, that was an excellent introduction, John. I just want to add that so this work we've done, this report on participatory futures, is really our approach to democratize futures and to make it accessible to those that are working in public policy, that are working with civic organizations or the community at large. And to be able to use these methods and to learn how to integrate them into the work that they're doing for more diversity in the type of work they do. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about, different experiences, different perspectives, points of view, having those conversations, as well as more inclusive engagement and allowing others to be part of the dialogue, part of the conversation, in really shaping the future that they want. So this report is really exciting because it breaks it down in a way that helps, those that perhaps don't have a background in future studies to start to learn the basic components of how participatory futures is organized and how they can start to integrate it in the work that they do.
Okay, and that I think was key for me. It's about shaping the future, which indicates to me that we have some control. And so maybe John, I'll have you go through, because I think in the report it talks about work you did, but can you just briefly describe what you did around the 2060 scenarios to give the audience just an understanding of really how immersive this can be?
Yeah, so I'll start by highlighting, I think, a critical aspect that you mentioned is that we're really trying to reinforce and enhance the agency with which people feel that they have and the capacity to act upon the future within the present. And so that takes lots of different forms. And you mentioned the Hawaii 2060 project. This was a follow-up to a highly successful project I think maybe a decade or so earlier that really focused on experiential futures. And what that means is you walk into a room and you are literally in that future. So we have costuming, we have artifacts, we even had some food. We tried to really make it ambiance. And this is really based on some really exciting research that shows that when we think about the future, the parts of our brain that light up are the parts associated with episodic memory. So the aim is actually to create memories from the future, to sort of implant them, if you will, through experiential means. And so the project that we used, similar to the one years before, was 4 different rooms, 4 different futures, to have people live and breathe in those spaces. So it's not just a mental exercise. They really feel a sense of emotional engagement with some of the challenges, but also the opportunities in those different futures.
Yeah, like that is very cool to me, because I swear the reason I got my job with the Alberta Emergency Management Agency was because I contacted someone at the Provincial Operations Center to get a tour of the center so I could understand what the office space looks like, what it smells like in there, what people are doing, so I could create that experience to help shape my my goal of getting a job there. And that's really, like, you can do that at that level. You can, like, the fact that you're bringing in actors with artifacts from the future, like, that's like, it's like, it just sounds fun. Like, it sounds fun.
It is a lot of fun. And how I relate this to emergency management in the work that we do is we often do either tabletop exercises or live play exercises. But we have scenarios that are based perhaps on the past or current state, things that we're familiar with, and the known. And in futures really looks at future scenarios or future experiential type of opportunities to engage in a completely different operational environment. And therefore it really brings out different emotions, different feelings, and different perspectives of what type of future we want to create. So it's a wonderful way to facilitate a deeper dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that's critical for emergency managers that are working to develop programs, because I know, if I get this term right, is it ethnography or ethnography? Ethnography, things like that, to use those tools to help create programs and services for the public or to help shape policy. I know when we, again, back at the government, we developed our latest local emergency management regulation using the Alberta CoLab, which I think is along the lines of what you guys work in. It's maybe, Donna, like your emergency management lab you have. Is that what is that lab?
The Emergency Management Futures Lab?
Yeah.
So this lab is more focused on anticipatory and adaptive leadership capabilities. So we work in a variety of ways. There's a number of different workshops. Some of it really helps to explore the horizon, kind of what's happening in the larger, broader environment. So this would be beyond our typical hazard lens or our hazard risk assessments that we do, to look at more of a systemic type of picture, right, of what's happening and where disruptions can take place. So we call that horizon scanning. We also focus on uncertainty. Right. So uncertainty is about really going into the unknown and knowing how to engage with it and how to develop agency out of that. And that's where we use a lot of future scenarios. So very different from the scenarios in emergency management, but definitely provides a rich opportunity to explore a very different world and how you could be resilient in that world. And usually when we facilitate these types of discussions, usually in a workshop format, the dialogue that comes out is quite exciting, and it's really energizing for participants. And then there's also different workshops that focus on creating a vision, the preferred image or vision of the future. And this is where participatory futures fits in, where you can do that with a number of diverse stakeholders or communities that you work with, and get different perspectives and points of view in shaping that future.
Do you, like, so for example, like the Hawaii one, because I think when was that done? 2006? When did you do that work in Hawaii, John?
The initial project was 2005, and then we did a follow-up. I think it was 2011 was the one that we had. And
so how, like, I'm more curious about, okay, so you did that 15 years ago with a follow-up in 2011. We're in 2020. Like, how close is that community or that area moving towards what you kind of thought you would shape?
Well, this is actually a great example of what is one of the occupational hazards, I think, of doing futures work. So the anecdote that we include in the report says that we had this event in 2011, and we were modeling scenarios, creating simulations, having this experiential sort of, event for 2060. And what we did was we did lots of interviews with top experts. I mean, the School of Oceanic and Earth Science Technology is considered one of the top in the world at the University of Hawaii. And we got lots of data, but then we modeled that data into these different scenarios. And some of them were quite extremes, sort of like you find in the IPCC reports. And so we had varying levels of sea level rise. And actually in that event, what happened was one of the top oceanographers, actually the dean of the school, came and said, this is irresponsible. This is basically like, ridiculous. This is absurd. And that's 2011.
Wow.
Fast forward 3 years later. At that point, I had left the island. I had started my consulting practice and was traveling a bit. He returns to a follow-up event and goes directly to my mentor, who was the coordinator of the project. And he says, "I'm really sorry. Excuse me." And
Wow.
he was a bit struck. He said, what are you apologizing? He said, 3 years ago, I said it was ridiculous. But in 3 years, what happened was, what was the extreme scenario for sea level rise was now the baseline scenario.
Wow.
So in a radically short period of time, what had happened was that the fantastical all of a sudden seemed like the unavoidable. So this is actually a really great anecdote, even though some might say, wait, it's a failure. You were trying to model 2060, and all of a sudden, 3 years later, it seems far more relevant.
Yeah.
And so for me, actually, that's a great success, because what we were trying to do is not say this is what 2060 is going to be, but really try to get people into a different headspace. In fact, the only reason we use 2050, 2060, sometimes even 2100, is to say to people, your assumptions don't have value here. We can't presume to know what the world is going to be like. So we have to explore, we have to play, we have to be creative in this space and really open it up to a space of possibility. And that can really be destabilizing. So, I would say that there are a variety of aspects of those scenarios that are looking more likely than others. But what I like about that story is that it hits on, I think, the key thing is, can we really use the future, as we say sometimes, to disturb the present? And I think in that instance, we actually did.
Can we use the future to disturb? That's pretty cool, actually. I have to think a little bit about that. So if you're just joining us live, we're with Donna Dupont, founder and chief strategist in Foresight and Design for Purple Compass, and Dr. John A. Sweeney. He is associate professor of futures at Foresight at Narhoz University in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and is currently a Foresight advisor for Interpol. And we're discussing participatory futures in emergency management. And Tobias just put up a comment here. We're seeing the same situation now, the pandemic, far-fetched ideas and response actions before to the public are standard precautions now. Yeah. It's so much so that I think people are still trying to process what's going on.
Definitely. I think that for those that have done a fair bit of work in pandemic planning or are working right now, responding to COVID-19, we're seeing that a lot of our assumptions, our planning assumptions, what we thought would happen in a pandemic, being completely dismantled right now, and we are seeing convergence sometimes of different hazards with COVID-19 and other hazards, but also the cascading impacts of the current pandemic is far beyond what many of us would have probably modeled in scenarios. Maybe futurists may have done that on the social and environmental and economic side, but in traditional emergency management scenario work, these types of scenarios are quite extreme. But we're seeing this play out right now, and so this is just a really great example of that there is so much happening in the broader environment, and our assumptions are being challenged. And so it's really important to examine those assumptions and to make sure, are they in fact true, and do we need to adjust our assumptions and shift our lens at which we're looking at the environment and potential emerging and future risk.
Yeah,
and,
no. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to jump in and say that I think the pandemic is also a great example of one of the challenges sometimes in doing this work is that, of course, you sometimes want to be careful about the information you're sharing. So we know that there were simulations that were run even just months before the pandemic, specifically on a novel coronavirus and what that outbreak could mean. But I think Donna hits on a really important point. It's not just that, but the variety of other factors, how it's accelerated certain trends, disrupted others, how it's, of course, the secondary pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. And then I think most importantly, how so many of those exercises were not radically participatory. So that knowledge is really constrained to a certain group or a certain, space, and it raises questions. And I think some of those questions are, ethical considerations and even have political ramifications. How do you engage a public in this? How do you work with citizens with these kinds of questions? And I think that's what a lot of the work and certainly the report is after, is what if we rethought how we approach helping people think about the future? And we did that by making the participatory aspect a part of the DNA of whatever those processes are. And again, I think there's a long history of that in futures, but I think now we're seeing a real renaissance specifically in this space. And of course now, because so many things are in flux, it's a time of radical uncertainty, and of course a time where a lot of people are worried about what the next few months are going to look like. Now's a really great moment to really lean in and say, okay, like what do we want the future to be? How can we start to mobilize collective action to try to shape it?
Yeah, and Katie agrees there. You're right, because at least in my experience in my world, and I see this all the time, whether it's governments or private sector or whatever, their disaster and emergency management exercises are, we're going to get hit by a tornado. We're going to get hit by a fire. The tornado is going to go from, in Canada, Red Deer to Edmonton, and it's going to take out so many people. And again, there's a certain group that, even though the emergency plans, and Donna, actually before we started, you talked about the Canadian Emergency Management Framework that now talks about whole of society approach. And still, we're not doing exercises with the whole of society in that sense. We're leaving a large segment out, and we're not talking about the future. We're talking about present day risks or hazards that could happen. Like they do these exercises in February to be prepared for June. And I understand that need, but my gosh, we're going through so much right now. Like, we know what to do. People know the solutions. They know how to prepare. I often ask, what's holding us back from taking this step and doing like a participatory futures outlook, and having legislature or elected officials and senior executives really start to work for the future outside of their 4-year election cycle.
Absolutely, and it is it's a culture shift in how we engage with the future. We're very focused on the short term and quick decisions. Especially there, today's decisions, things are shifting, and it's quite complex. And when you have a very complex environment, this is not linear thinking. This is not cause and effect type of decisions or solutions. It requires a more holistic approach and a more inclusive approach, and so you definitely do want all those different perspectives to uncover the blind spots in your thinking. And so it is a different shift in the way we think about the future, as the future is not something that we can predict or control, but something that we can shape. And so we have agency to create the future we want, but it depends on the actions we take today, the decisions we make today. And we have to have a vision. If you don't have a vision, you don't know what you're moving towards. So you're just kind of moving day to day in the present and dealing with the issues as they present themselves, but not knowing where you want to navigate, towards a bigger vision. And that vision in Canada is resiliency. And we're seeing that word resilience pop up in a number of global frameworks, the Foresight Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. And they all focus, on vulnerable communities and resilience. And as part of that resilience piece, it's about engagement, a whole of society approach, and really allowing opportunities to have a different kind of conversation.
So this is kind of where my wacky brain goes when I hear things like that, and I don't know if there's any research or evidence to prove this, but we know that at an individual level, people experience stress, PTSD, acute stress, when they feel like they don't have agency, when they feel like they lose a bit of control. And so if a whole of society is participating in a participatory future scenarios across the country, and it helps them to develop more empowerment and a sense of control, a sense of more control that they can shape their future, would we start to see on many different levels, individual to organizational to government, like a reduction in stressors in that sense, or that feeling of overwhelm on multiple levels? Like, I don't know. I just know at work, if I feel I have more control over my job, I am less stressed. If I have more agency, I'm less stressed. So I'm wondering if the system as a whole has more agency and the individuals in it feel less stressed, more in control. Does that sort of make it healthier?
That's an interesting, I think, observation. I would say that there is likely some correlation with societies that have invested in participatory, forward-looking forms of governance and the way that they rate their overall level of happiness, right? So when you look at, countries like Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Finland, they often rank a bit higher in sort of, how they feel about their own happiness level. And those are countries, and some of them actually have had, very long-standing institutions that have focused on future studies and have governments that have invested in these kinds of practices. So again, I think we're probably in the land of correlation, not causation.
Right.
But I do want to mention that there's a really interesting feedback loop. When you mentioned this kind of, not having agency in trauma, research has now shown as well that when people are in this state of trauma, they have a shortened sense of the future.
Yeah.
So it's actually more difficult to look and to be, forward thinking in this moment. So that's why precisely we need a lot more intentionality, a lot more focus. And again, and having worked directly either in big organizations or, with governments, it requires people to really champion it. And that's actually why in the report, we focus a lot on case studies, because then you're not out there championing something that people can't see and understand. You can see where it's worked. You can see what have been the struggles. You can try to understand what some of those practices that have, really been useful are. And I think that's really quite critical to feel like you're not alone in championing this, because I think, as Donna said, it requires a cultural shift. And that cultural shift is really going to be, by the people who want to champion it and find the people to follow, and to really kind of build that in a very organic way.
Mm-hmm. And just to build on that, the cultural shift too also needs to take place within the profession of emergency management itself, because we are very much of paramilitary origins, and so there's a very strong command and control type of structure. We deal with IMS and ICS, and these are really important when you're in an emergency and a crisis. But outside of a crisis, it's a different kind of model when you're trying to engage participants, and you want a collaboration, co-creation, and you want a different kind of relationship where you're building trust, where you're able to exchange in a very safe environment. So some of, like, for example, the military speaks of this shift in command and control as being command to the edge, meaning that it's more of a flattening of the structure, and it's more lateral. And so you are engaged, but in different ways. And so there's a more of a dynamic conversation happening between, the existing structures and the broader community. And so you're able to take information in and out and process it in a different way. And so I'm still searching for real examples of that in action, but in theory, that's what the discussions are. That's the type of discussions taking place.
Yeah, that's good, because command and control drives me crazy. So and I'm going to get to Paul and Paul's comment quick, but again, I don't know if there's evidence or if this could be true, but I sincerely believe that, at least in Alberta, and John, I don't know if you're too familiar with Alberta and what Alberta's gone through in the last 10 years, especially with the Slave Lake fires in 2011, the 2013 floods, the Fort McMurray floods. I do not think the province as a whole has recovered on a mental health aspect as individuals, as a collective. Our infrastructure is barely recovered. Our systems have barely recovered. And because of those three major shocks to our community as a whole, the whole province, all 4 million, I sincerely think that that is what is hampering our province from being able to see the future at various levels. Like, take it out of the individual level, but I just, Alberta has not been able to get out of this economic turmoil and climate turmoil because I think we keep getting hit with these major shocks that we can't recover from, and that there's a loss of foresight there. So, yeah, Paul, absolutely, preparation is key. Planning is more important than the plan, and reading the plan is more important than the plan, and updating the plan is more important than the plan. 100%.
Definitely. And we're in an environment where we have to constantly learn and adapt to a very fast changing environment. And again, it's about questioning our assumptions. The futures is all about that. Whereas perhaps traditional planning and exercises are more about testing processes, testing plans, but not really questioning whether we're testing the right things. Or if we're planning for the right things. So futures helps to kind of take you in a different direction.
Yep.
Yeah. And I would jump in and say that, you know, we often get this question around, well, isn't this risk management, or isn't this strategic planning? And the answer is always, you know, foresight and futures can enhance those processes. We want to widen the scope of analysis a little bit. And we want to try to find ways, of course, now to make those far more radically participatory. In relation to that point and kind of control, I'll go back to the great American poet Mike Tyson, who said, you know, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And I think now more than ever, what we're seeing is, you know, exactly what you mentioned, Brad, about, you know, Alberta is communities who feel like they're being strung along from one crisis to the next. And so I think what this offers really is a participatory and agency building and enhancing means to try to break those cycles. And of course, there's no guarantees, because just as we're seeing now in this moment, you know, these events and these things happen, but the kinds of resilience that we ultimately want to build is something that has to be shared, and that has to really move towards imagination. So I think it has to activate that in a collective sense. And of course, as we know, communities on the front lines are the best place to say what works and what doesn't work, and to take that learning and have that be shared, and to do it in a way that it does, you know, give back and feedback, so that hopefully we're better prepared for the next.
And just to build on that, I think an important part of that is really understanding what's working and what's not working, as John said, and being able to be comfortable to let go with discernment of those things that aren't working anymore, to create space for new opportunities, to evolve your profession, your organization, the work that you do. And so it becomes more of a spiral of adaptation and constant learning and growth as you move through a very dynamic environment.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to Tobias's comment because I understand where he's coming from. I'm going to push back on him a little tiny bit, because project management is necessary, but I find that if you focus too much on it, executives and higher level people get frustrated with it. And I think it's absolutely necessary for an emergency management agency to have a project management area or function. I don't think every emergency manager needs to be a project manager, and I don't even think that they need to necessarily have a lot of skills in it, but they should have access to project management. And I'm wondering, from a systems design foresight, where do you guys see project management fitting into it?
Well, I've worked with project management frameworks, especially when I was a provincial planner in Ontario. So I find that project management is excellent for implementation.
Yeah.
When you have your idea, your vision, your strategy, your policy all intact, you know what you want to invest, you know, your new investments, new resources, and then putting it in a project management framework for implementation is extremely helpful, because it helps to keep you on track for implementation. So what we're talking about is more front-end design methodologies to help you get that bigger vision, to help you establish your policy and your strategy so that you can implement it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can help put this within the context of an example. So a few years ago, I was the Global Futures and Foresight Coordinator for the International Federation Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, world's largest humanitarian organization. The Secretariat's housed in Geneva, and every 10 years they do their strategy development process, which just finished actually just last year, and I was kind of on the front end of that. And what we said was, how do we engage 190 countries? And we don't even know how many volunteers were in the organization time, somewhere between 11 and 14 million people. How do is a survey going to cut it? Is there a certain framework that's going to help us here? I mean, we needed to radically rethink what engagement looked like. What we ultimately settled upon, in part because there was an amazing partnership opportunity, was working with Newcastle University's Open Lab, which focuses on human-computer interaction. And we built a game that was delivered entirely on WhatsApp. Now, of course, there are limitations around access, but what that allowed us to do was ultimately to engage 4,000 people from 120 countries. That's 4,000 voices that would have not had the opportunity to have been heard as part of this process. 4,000 perspectives, 120 countries is a pretty amazing cross-section of the organization. And that was really fascinating because it actually forced the organization not only to look out in a different way, but to look inward and to rethink what its strategy development process could be, which I think had actual impacts in relation to not only the outcomes, the actual challenges, targets, and goals, so to speak, that it was looking at, but in how it thought about evaluation, how it thought about assessment, how it thought about what that process looked like when the opportunity came to have these reviews come up, and to even think what does the review look like if we can access a group like that on WhatsApp. And so again, it by thinking differently on the front end, it really allowed us then to imagine different possibilities as it unfolded.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Tobias. And yeah, no, that hopefully that gives you a bit of insight on that. Katie, yeah, feeling saturated with COVID for sure. What would you say as practitioners is the most critical question to ask of ourselves as we move forward to try and promote a futures approach with such a degree of fatigue and uncertainty? Yeah, that's a good one.
A very good one.
What's the most critical question to ask ourselves as we move forward to try and promote a futures approach?
Well, I would say right now, given the level of fatigue, I think probably a very important thing to do right now is just awareness in terms of just what's working and what's not working. And so starting to capture those lessons learned and documenting them right now. It may be hard to process the future right now because you're so immersed in the present, but this is a time to document, and to write down those notes, capture lessons learned, capture what's not working, capture ideas of inspiration that come to you now. And then when you have space after this is settled, perhaps when you're doing your debrief or when there's more of an opportunity post COVID to start to explore this, then that's an opportunity to really dig deeper and to start to really work with some of those ideas that you captured at this time.
Yeah, I think to jump in, and I think Donna really hit on the critical questions for me. It's sort of, how do I balance the kind of the professional shift that has happened, right? So every single in-person engagement, of course, now is either postponed or online or trying to figure it out. And Zoom fatigue is a real thing, right? So it is balancing that kind of professional shift, really with self-care. I mean, how do we find ways to bring further reflection, like Donna's saying? And I even know for myself, it's also been a challenge in how I'm learning during this time. Of course, events like this are great. The conversation is emergent, it's dynamic, and it's going to be recorded so we can capture that learning. But a lot of times it is working with different groups and different colleagues and trying to build better systems, because now everything, of course, is online. At least the work that I'm fortunate to be able to still do, and even folks in different time zones. So we collaborate a lot with colleagues in Australia, and we have colleagues on the some on the like sort of in on the U.S. time zone, and sort of in North America. And so, how do we just be more mindful during this time? And I think that's something that really is, for myself as a practitioner, how am I more mindful in the ways that I am engaging? Because I think, of course, people want to engage, but we don't really know what everyone is dealing with and struggling with. So I think as a facilitator, we try to build in some of that reflexivity into some of those processes. And of course, that can elicit all kinds of really powerful things. So, we've had events recently where people have spoke openly about family members being sick and the kind of worry and the kind of, how that does shape how they think and feel about the future. And that odd sense of wanting to feel something different, a post whatever this looks like, but also that the tyranny of the present, if you will, that kind of immediacy of this moment and the struggle to balance that. So I think that's where, a lot of a healthiness for myself I've tried is focusing on reflection and learning, and to make sure that that's part of also the processes that I'm using when I'm able to facilitate.
Yeah, and Betty, thanks for your comment about Vancouver, downtown Hastings Street. Absolutely. I would encourage you to Google In With Forward. They are a not-for-profit out of the West Coast that is doing awesome work around social innovations and all of that in your area. So In With Forward, Dr. Sarah, I think that's, do you guys know In With Forward? Are you aware? Yeah, I think it's I can't remember her last name, but I'll call her Dr. Sarah. So check that out, Betty. And Camilo, thanks. Yes, sometimes absolutely we tend to forget about our own emotional intelligence and emotional awareness for self and others. So Michael asks, how can futures thinking be incorporated into EM education? Great segue into what Donna was talking about earlier about systems thinking within the disaster risk reduction competencies, or the what are being called the next generation core competencies. There is some levels there. Do you want to talk to that a little bit, Donna?
Sure. So I had an opportunity to review those next generation EM core competencies that were published in 2017. And I found them really compatible with what we're talking about here in terms of futures, so foresight, participatory futures, and even design. So there's three in particular. So first of all, it's just, what we talked about this already, is this importance of continual learning. So this is very important right now because we're learning a lot. Our assumptions are being challenged, so we need to be aware of that and try to capture as best as we can. But three really three core competencies really stood out for me. So the first one is systems literacy. And so the importance of this. So, and this is really critical for emergency managers, because we're dealing with complex systems. We work within a systems type of network. Where there's a lot of variables. It's very hard to predict with any degree of certainty. And so there is a lot of uncertainty. So understanding complexity, understanding how to work with complex adaptive systems, and also how to engage others in the participatory futures way to really get different perspectives, points of view, to uncover some of those blind spots that perhaps if we were just in our offices or in our silos, we may not be aware of some of the broader issues that are facing a particular problem set. So that's a really important one. And systems thinking is very compatible with futures thinking. In fact, if you want to do futures well, you need to be a good systems thinker, because this, the broader systemic environment is very dynamic and it's in constant state of change. So that's an important, thing to understand, and it's an important skill set to be able to cultivate. And then to bring that into, emergency management work that you do. The other one is disaster risk management. And so we all understand the importance of disaster risk management, but it's really getting at the interdependencies within the system. So again, to do it well, you need to have that systems lens to understand the interdependencies, to understand how things are linked. This is not linear thinking. This is, not cause and effect. So having this skill set will help you understand risk in a different way. And also it talks about the importance of, within disaster risk management, the resilience, building resilience and thriving communities. So again, there's this engagement piece that is an important part of the work that we do. And the more that we engage different stakeholders, then the more collective intelligence we'll have in terms of understanding the current state and understanding where all those stakeholders want to go. But one of the final competencies that I thought was really helpful, and I was really glad to see, was community engagement. It was right there. And within the context of community engagement, it's really about working with communities for shared vision and values.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of relationship. This is not top down. This is a network type of approach. It's a new type of building trust, building partnerships. And within that is working with communities for a shared vision of where you want to move towards. And so I was happy to see that word vision, because that is getting into futures thinking and really beyond the current state, beyond what we know, and start to imagine where we would like to go. And then how do we work together in a very collaborative way to shape it?
Yeah, and I'll just do a plug. So if anyone wants to see the FEMA Next Generation Core Competencies for Emergency Management Professionals report, it's on my website at hazardscape.com under the blog. And Dr. Feldman Jensen, I've spoken with her, and she's good that we promote this as long as she gets credit. So I want to recognize Dr. Feldman Jensen with the others involved on publishing this report. And they're actually doing, I think, some other work on this line right now. And so it's you can go there, get the report if you haven't seen it. It's eye-opening, and it's nice to know that there is something out there for emergency management in that regard. And thanks, Michael. That was an awesome question. Absolutely. And so again, if you're just joining us, we've got Donna Dupont from Purple Compass with us, and John A. Sweeney. I'm going to say right now, Associate Professor of Futures at Foresight at Narhoz University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. I hope I'm saying that right. And as also the Foresight Advisor for Interpol, which sounds like a cool job. I would imagine. Like, can you tell us what you're doing there?
Happily. So my work with Interpol, and I've been really fortunate to work with them for the last year. I'm basically consulting directly and liaising directly with what's called the Global Complex for Innovation, which is based in Singapore. And within that, they have a Futures and Foresight lab, who's basically tasked with collaborating with groups like Europol, basically, national level NCBs, as they call them, national police, to look at the kinds of practices that they have to try to anticipate, of course, crimes, to try to anticipate shifts within policing and law enforcement. So we've been working on what's called the Interpol's Global Horizon Scan. We've been doing this fundamentally we've sort of been bootstrapping it, if you will, to try to bring together the shared learning, because what we're finding is a lot of organizations are doing this, but they're not exactly focusing on, let's say, the impacts and implications for police and law enforcement. Or you have certain police replicating a certain issue, their analysis of it, or even the directorates within Interpol, right? So what we're trying to do is, again, just create more of a streamlined learning process to allow the organization to help to facilitate further international cooperation, which is really its mandate, and to allow that learning to be diffused across its members. And I think that's something that, again, is still very much a work in progress. Of course, like everything else, it was upended completely by the virus. But I think fundamentally what we've seen is a lot of the core practices and ideas that we put into place actually are exactly what we've come back to now, given that we couldn't have in-person meetings, or given that, of course, there was a bit of a chaos as things began to unfold. But the core tenets were still there, right? How do we get better at anticipating? How do we get better at learning? And how do we learn together in a more productive, creative way? And then how do we make sure that we're not just talking to ourselves and navel-gazing, but that we really are challenging our assumptions by bringing in diverse voices, by focusing on inclusivity, by not just going to the experts, but fundamentally asking people and connecting with communities and seeing, what's happening to them, what are the issues. So a real kind of global to local spectrum for thinking about the future.
Yeah, I like that, global to local. So if you have comments or questions, don't be afraid to post in the comments under this post. So what haven't we talked about in regards to participatory futures or the NESTA report? I'll bring up the NESTA website in a bit, but what haven't we touched on? I mean, I'm sure we covered it all.
Well, we covered a whole lot. The one thing I would want to mention is that, there's probably nothing worse to get someone excited by something and writing a report about it. However, even though I like the report, what we decided was, we actually have to walk the walk. So we built a game that is based on the report.
I got it right here.
Excellent. And what I'm actually most proud is the game is open source Creative Commons. So the game is actually designed as a platform that anyone can customize, anyone can localize. We're in discussions to have different language versions of the game. It's available for download on GitHub. And basically what that means is you're not just talking about the ideas and the competencies, you can actually put them into practice and actually use it with, your team, your organization, your community. And I think we've had some great sessions online already. We just ran one a little while ago as part of the Primer conference, which is a large speculative foresight or speculative futures, design futures engagement. And so that's something I think it's quite important is, of course, the report is, I think, great to read, but I'm biased. Don't take my word for it. But the game itself, you can actually play with the ideas.
Yeah, this is so I printed this off because I'm going to take it on vacation with my family and make my kids play it.
Good.
And I say that because I played similar games with Forward while they were facilitating some workshops here with the Edmonton Skills Society and Action Lab. And when I was doing my coaching mastery course with Essential Impact, they used a fairly similar tool to help us think about how we want to change cultures within our organizations using a coach approach. And it was extremely, extremely powerful. Yes, Tobias, we will put the link to the game. I've actually got the NESTA website up right now, and if you go to nesta.org.uk, I think the Participatory Futures Report is somewhere on here. If not, we've got a direct link for it, and the game is available there too. So I'll put that in the comments after this show, Tobias, and you can find it there. But yeah, I would print out the game. It's you can do it in black and white. It's pretty printer friendly, and then I would actually be totally into, if anyone's listening who wants to get together on a Zoom call and try it out as a group, I would totally be into that. So if you're into that, let me know and I'll arrange to play this game, because I think you could do it virtually, right? Online, have the cards in front of you and the game board.
Well, we've created a virtual game board. So as part of Action Foresight Global Swarm, who were co-authors of the NESTA Participatory Futures Report, John mentioned that we did this Primer conference. So that was virtual conference with people all over the world, and we had 10 tables, all playing at different tables. Participatory futures, and exploring the game and really having really fabulous conversations about the future. So definitely, and as the Global Swarm, we are looking to have a variety of different activities to engage a community of practice going forward. So one of those is having regular type of micro game organization events. So awesome. We can definitely set something up if there's enough interest, and we can, tailor it a bit to the emergency management community to make it a little bit more relevant to some of the issues and trends that the community is facing, and to really start to have a different kind of conversation. That would be great. And for anyone who's interested in being involved in the Participatory Futures Community of Practice, we do have a Slack group. So I can share that link.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sign me up.
Mm-hmm. And it's free for anyone who wants to join and wants to share and learn with a bunch of international futurists. Awesome.
Sign me up, because I want to know going forward if I should be investing in Zoom or whatever. I think you guys so, okay, let me ask you this, because this is, again, where my head goes. So who were the early futurists, from 20, 30 years ago? And did they buy stock in Zoom? Have they are they sitting at home with a small nuclear generator in their basement powering their house? I I don't know. No.
I'll tell two quick anecdotes. So oftentimes futures thinking and foresight is traced back to even as far back as the 1940s, 1950s, and there are two figures that are really seen as being the two kind of poles. One is Herman Kahn in the U.S., who helped to create Rand Corporation, had a lot of investment, of course, in military, was highly influential in sort of like even like global thermonuclear war, thinking about policy at the international level, but was really seen as a figure that cast a large shadow, if you will, and really actually is thought to have coined the term scenario, at least in the parlance of how futurists use it. But he had a very very geopolitical focus. On the other side was someone who I've actually learned a lot about recently, who was Robert Juncker. Robert Juncker was an Austrian who fled the Nazis during World War II. Ended up settling in Switzerland for a time, and then back in Austria. And long story short, he was radically participatory in his practices. He was doing and actually created what was called the first Futures Workshop, and wrote a book about it with some colleagues. And still to this day, his work's highly influential in Germany and German-speaking contexts. But he was actually getting people together over 2 or 3 days and going through processes to kind of imagine the future, to interrogate these what was wrong, the problem. I mean, this is before design thinking, systems thinking, even foresight as a field. He was doing these kinds of things. So there are long roots to these kinds of practices and processes. And I think that the other answer to your question is, I always tell my father, there's, if you see a poor futurist, maybe something's wrong. But I did have a buddy who many years ago was doing the launch for Ethereum, which is the second largest cryptocurrency. And he's become a good friend. And very early on, he got me involved in that. So I'm not going to say that I'm living underground with my in my sort of bunker, even though it kind of looks like it.
Yeah.
But actually, that it was funny because my father was an accountant for 40 years, and I bought a little bit of this, and I kept emailing him. I say, Dad, this is $5. Dad, this is $10. Dad, this and so it was that sort of thing, right? But I think there is that kind of question of also and some futurists, of course, focus on finance and other things.
Sure.
But I think that there are people who clearly maybe even beyond the title of futurists, we're really good at spotting those trends and gravitating and seeing those emerging futures, and of course having the agency to try to shape it or take action. But again, clearly no crystal ball, not a big part of what we do.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And H.G. Wells was even earlier, absolutely. And so that kind of leads me. I had a quick thought, but it evaporated.
Well, I just want to
go
add
ahead.
to John's,
Go ahead.
Statement. So to building on that, with Herman Kahn, who was one of the first futurists, post Second World War, in a very different geopolitical environment. We're seeing now, and we've seen this since that time, that futures and futurists have a long history in military planning and operations.
Yeah.
And we see that in Canada. So Defense Research Development Canada has a cell with futurists, and they are deployed across the armed forces in different capacity. But what we're seeing now is the Canadian Forces College and the Canadian Armed Forces really trying to expand this skill set of futures and design. So they call it design thinking, but it encompasses systems, it encompasses human-centered design and foresight, all into this new next level skill set for future generals. So we're senior military officers with these new skill sets for the VUCA environment. So for those who are not familiar with that term, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So this is a very different kind of environment that we are living in now, and that we are going to be moving towards, or living in, and so it requires a different way of thinking and a different way of understanding and generating new ideas moving forward. So what this means is that there is a precedent for futures and design in a command and control type environment. It's starting to build and grow now and to scale across to become more of a recognized skill set across the Canadian Forces. But it's definitely there. And I think by seeing that, it inspires me in terms of what is the future for emergency management professionals in developing, acquiring these skill sets, and how will that have an impact on the work that we do?
Yeah, that's actually super exciting because, like you said earlier, we still feed from that paramilitary background from the 40s, 50s when civil defense owned emergency management. So, and then I'm excited because inherently, I think emergency management also follows business practices and private sector. So if private sector is investing in this stuff, government's going to follow at some point in a major way if they're not already doing it in bits now, and that's only going to mean very good things for the future, I think.
Absolutely.
The earlier thought when you said RAND, I attended a resiliency workshop that one of the researchers co-facilitated there with Daniel P. Aldridge, who's authored a number of books on how to build resilience. And they did a community asset mapping exercise where we got together as groups and mapped all the assets within a community and how that community could use those assets to kind of become more resilient. And even though it was more about looking at current acute hazards and risks, it wasn't planning for the deep future. I think that the group left those 2 days with a totally different perspective on the resources and capacity and capability of their community. So RAND is definitely doing like top-notch stuff from in that area too.
Yeah, that's excellent to hear because I'm familiar with Daniel Aldridge's work, and he speaks a lot about social capital and social infrastructure, and so that that capacity, that local level grassroots building capacity at a civic and social level that's needed. And I think it's extremely important, and it's very much compatible with what we're talking about when we speak about participatory futures.
Yeah, and political. He goes a lot into the political aspect of it, and the closer ties you have to politicians, the better off you are after a disaster. And I see it with COVID, right? I see it with COVID-19, and organizations and different communities are getting treated slightly different because of the ties they have with politicians. Like here in Alberta, the Economic Recovery Panel, made up of very well-established professionals, but they've been around the block a lot. They've had time to implement their ideas, and they got together and said, "Hey, let's use our old ideas for post-COVID and COVID-19 adaptation." And so Alberta released their economic recovery plan that looks like the post or the pre-COVID recovery plan. And I'm like, how you're using old ideas to deal with trying to adapt to this crazy time, and I don't think it's going to work. So that's just my own rant. So any last minute points or any last minute comments to come in or questions if you're still with us? If not, I think if you guys want to tell us where we can find you, I know you're both on LinkedIn, purplecompass.com, purplecompass.ca. John, are you on Twitter, Instagram, anything like that? LinkedIn?
Yes. I typically use aloha_futures from the 9 magical years I got to spend on island.
Awesome.
The one thing I did want to mention is that, the opportunity that we're in now, if we see it as such, is a chance to not just, talk differently, but to act differently. And so, what if imagination was a critical infrastructure? What if we saw agency and hope as things that were essential to resiliency? And I think that's something that I think the work is trying to get at. So I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to have this conversation. And thanks so much.
That's imagination is critical infrastructure. That is awesome because I used to work for General Electric in the early 2000s, and we had imagination rooms. And they saw imagination as a critical piece to their business operations and their strategic thinking.
Mhm.
Can I steal that term?
Oh,
Like imagination is critical infrastructure?
yes.
That is awesome. Donna, where can we find you? Purplecompass.ca?
Purplecompass.ca. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to connect there, or if you want to send me an email, that's at donna@purplecompass.ca. Yeah, and so thank you so much, Brad. I really enjoyed this conversation.
It's awesome.
And, enjoyed just speaking to emergency management professionals around participatory futures and just how this can really help to advance some of the work as we move towards resiliency.